Good afternoon. My clicker isn't working, but while we sort that out, this has the potential to be the perfect storm of the post-lunch slump, combined with the fact that I'm going to say the words security awareness, which tends to have an instant reaction and puts people to sleep. But what I hope to do is make it a little bit more interesting than that. So what I'm actually going to do is unpick why security awareness isn't really working. I'm going to do that by looking at some behavioural science, some psychology, and then turn to what the behavioural science tells us we actually should be doing instead, and then show you some examples of how you can apply that to your security awareness. So I want to start by looking at an example. So here we have someone working in a big city. Sorry, I should have changed the animation to be Manchester. That was London. She's working really hard, and she is doing her security awareness training. And you can tell that because she is clicking next, next, and yawning. Now, what we have to think about is that when Kate finishes her awareness training, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is going to kick in. And this tells us that within about 5 days, she's only going to remember about 20% of what she was taught. And that's clearly a problem because we need her to understand this and we need her to protect herself if she encounters any situations. So life changes for Kate. She's working really, really hard because she's kind of trying to get some stuff done before she goes on holiday. She goes on holiday, she's clearly not thinking about awareness then. She comes back, she's got loads of deadlines from her boss, loads of distractions, loads of Zoom calls like the rest of us. And then one day, she's been out partying a little bit with some friends. She comes back to work, perhaps a little bit jaded, still trying to meet those deadlines, constant distractions. There are a lot of kittens to look at on the internet. And a client asks her to do something. Catch-up video. Could you just upload this file? I need it really quickly. Could you share it to this site here? It's a really long time since Kate did her security awareness training. Is she really going to remember what we want her to do at this point? So let's explore that a little bit by looking at some psychology of how we actually behave and how we make decisions. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's just a couple of examples that might be useful. So the first is to think about fast and slow thinking. So we all like to think that we make really, really deliberate decisions in our day-to-day actions. But actually about 5% of the decisions we make each day are the deliberative kind of thought-through ones. The thought decision you made when you decided to come to this talk. But actually 95% of the decisions we make where we're kind of running on autopilot and we're just going with the flow and we're relying on cognitive biases. Perhaps those of you in the audience who came to this one because it was the room that you've been in all day and you didn't want to walk down a flight of stairs. So we're kind of on autopilot a lot of the time, and we have to take that into account because those cognitive biases are going to lead us to make decisions that we aren't necessarily making deliberately. And one of those biases is the availability heuristic. So we're always looking for an anchor to make a decision. And so things that we can kind of recall very easily will help us make that decision. It's why, for example, if you start looking for buying a car, then suddenly you see that car everywhere in the roads around you. It's just a bit more available in your head, so your brain is noticing it. So is there anything that's helped Kate in this situation? Is there any information that's more available? Perhaps if she was in an office and had seen a poster about cybersecurity, she might be thinking about it a bit more. Present bias is also quite an important feature. So we're all trying to deal with things and get short-term rewards. And so Kate will be really prompted by the fact that her client is asking her to do something and they want it now. Priming is interesting. It's a bit similar to availability heuristic, but we can prime people by talking about things. So there's lots of examples of where people will use really positive words to then make you act in a particular way. And so if you start saying no, 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 and then you can create this sort of negative vibe. So has she been primed in any particular way by something that's reminded her about security? Context is also really important. We're really steered by the context we're in. It's why that when we're working from home, we're perhaps a little bit less security aware. We haven't had to put on maybe a jacket. We haven't got our lanyard on. And so we're not necessarily thinking in such a secure way. So context is also really important. Emotion and affect also drives things. And in this situation, she's got that urgency. She's got a client to keep happy. So that's going to drive her to make a decision. And spacing. So when we learn something, it's much more helpful if that's spread out over time. It's like when we revise, yes, we can cram, but it's proven to be less effective than a little bit here, then change the topic, then come back and do some more. Kate hasn't really had that spacing as well in this situation. So let's think about what might have been an appropriate opportunity to help Kate with this situation. And that makes me want to talk about opportune moments. And we're all very familiar with fishing simulations and fish test train, and the seeming idea that this is actually a really good way to train people because it's an opportune moment. Well, there's some really interesting research where scientists looked at giving people feedback based on whether they were successful or whether they failed at a task. And what they found was that failure feedback was much less effective, even when they tried to make it easier for people. And their theory behind this was the fact that failure impacts your ego. You're slightly in denial of the situation. You don't really want to admit that it's happened. And if you ever interview people after they've fallen for a fishing test, well, some people quite often can't even recall that they did it. They're slightly in denial that situation happened. So is that really a good point to train someone and hope they're going to remember something? We're also seeing some things at the other end of the spectrum, where we're perhaps responding to events in the seam. Now, this is really useful data to know that someone needs training because something has happened. There's a real risk that training becomes seen as a punishment at this point, like with fish test train. And it's also really hard for people to contextualize it. So if a couple of days later someone says to you, look, you did this thing, can you really remember why, what was going through your head, what drove you to those decisions in order to learn? This isn't real time. And so we need to keep thinking about, what are we trying to do here? Is this about knowledge? Is that what we're trying to achieve? Well, there's lots of examples where even cybersecurity experts can get caught by social engineers. Ian Levy, for example, at NCSC, didn't go all the way, but he started to get caught by a social engineer. So if even experts can get caught, then maybe this isn't actually about knowledge. What are we trying to do here? Is it compliance? Well, yes, that's important. We need to tick that box. Is it expertise? No, I don't think it necessarily is, if experts are also falling for things. Is it awareness? Well, yes, we need people to be aware. But really, what we want is behaviour change. If we want to reduce risk, we need to change behaviours and get people acting in more secure ways. So awareness is really just the first step on this journey. A slight aside into other companies. Now, these guys aren't necessarily the good guys, but they have demonstrated that you can influence and steer people's behaviour while they're using their IT. And they use it to show us a lot more ads, but there's lots of cases now where behavioural science and behavioural economics has been used for good. So steering people towards vaccine take-up, donor cards, keeping fit. So we know that this stuff really works. We can influence people to essentially do things that are in their own interest. So what if we had a more people-centric approach to security? And the first thing to say here would be that people would come to work focused on their day job. Seems a bit of a strange thing to have to say, but sometimes as security practitioners we forget that actually other people shouldn't be thinking about security all the time. They've got a job to do, they've got to earn money for the business, for example. So if that's going to work, they need to find it really easy to act securely. They've got to want to or understand why it's important. And they need these cues and timely reminders. And these three elements I'll come back to later, this idea of ease, motivation, and timeliness, are fundamental to the behavioural change theory. Behind the scenes, we want in security to know what's going on. So who's looked at this content? How long have they looked at it? How are they answering questions? But much more interestingly, what risky behaviours are actually taking place? And as we intervene, are we changing those behaviours? And if you can get this right, you can actually start to get a measurable return on your investment in security awareness, because you can see behaviours, you can baseline them, and then you can steer people away from them. And we're not alone in thinking like this. So there's a lot of people talking about behavioural science in the world of security awareness, maybe a shift away from it being seen as a learning and development thing towards it being about engagement, culture, and behaviour change. So I want to now touch on the theory behind this. So what do the behavioural models tell us, and what does it look like to turn that into tools that can help us do this? So firstly, what are behavioural models? Well, they're put together by researchers and scientists to try and explain the way that humans behave. And they're a really good starting point to help us work out how we're going to intervene and how we're going to reduce risky behaviours. They have to come with a health warning. There is no rule book that says if you do this, a human being will do this. It just simply doesn't work like that. But they're a really good starting point to help us think about how we're going to drive secure behaviour change. So the first model I want to pick up is by a guy called Stern. And what Stern said was that any behaviour is this combination between our attitude how we think we're going to behave, what we want to do, and the context that we're in. And that kind of makes sense. But unfortunately, his research highlighted something quite important. So he found that this attitude-behaviour link was really strong. So the attitude drove our behaviour when context wasn't really doing much. So his research was mostly in recycling. So he's saying, if we believe in recycling, then we want to be green, then we will do that when it's easy. Unfortunately, the moment it gets difficult, the moment context gets in the way, it all goes out the window. It's too hard, and so people don't do it. And we all know this, and we all see it where people go round security controls because they've just got to do something. They just need to, print this file, so they send it home. They're just finding the easy way out. So context is really important, and we need to think about how we can introduce our awareness in context, and maybe even change the context to help people make the secure decision. Next, I want to look at two models side by side because they're quite similar and they kind of hint at some of the same things. So firstly, B.J. Fogg has a model on how any behaviour works. And he says there's three factors of any behaviour. The first is motivation. You've got to want to do it. And you see this in the lures that the bad guys use. So they're playing on motivation using things like fear, desire, a sense of inclusion, and social proof to make us click those links. Then there's ability. Can I do this thing? How easy is it for me to do this thing? But then really importantly, there's some timely trigger that's going to make you actually do that action, something that forces you to do it. And I'll come back to the Fogg model in more detail in a second. But this is important because this means for any behaviour to happen and any secure behaviour to happen, there needs to be this timely element, some sort of prompt to make you actually act. Next, we can look at the model that's put together by the Behavioural Insights team. So this used to be the nudge unit in the Cabinet Office. And they say that there's four components of a good nudge. And they have the EAST model. So the first part of that is easy. It's got to be easy to do that. And obviously this relates back to ability in Fogg's model. It's got to be attractive. It's got to be something we want to do. So the more attractive it is, the more we'll be drawn to it. That relates to motivation. Another aspect of motivation that they draw out separately is social. So we're social animals, we want to do what everyone else is doing. And there's some really interesting research, probably a lot of you have heard about getting people to not ask for new towels in hotels and using that social proof of the last person who stayed in this room didn't ask for an extra towel was significantly impactful in getting people to be greener. So that social proof is really effective. But they also draw out this timely element. So both these models are highlighting the importance of timeliness in how we help people change their behaviour. So let's drill a little bit further into Fogg, and he highlights this relationship between ability and motivation. And this kind of makes logical sense. So he says that if you're really, really motivated to do something, you can do something really hard. But if you really can't be bothered to do something, then actually, unless it's really easy, it's not going to happen. And if we want to think about where secure behaviours sit, unfortunately, they probably sit in the kind of unmotivated, unwilling camp. And that's not necessarily because people don't want to act securely. It's that there's a whole load of other things motivating. Like in Kate's example, she's got a client asking for something. That's a massive motivation in her mind of what she's got to do. So if you want people to do something securely, it's probably got to be easy, or the easiest course of action, ideally. Fogg also highlights that order matters. So we have a tendency in the industry to focus on motivation, and we use fear to do that. So watch out, you're going to get got, you're going to lose all your data, and we're trying to motivate people. Now, what Fogg highlights is that motivation is actually the hardest lever to pull. And you can kind of make sense of this if you think about fitness. So we all would like to be fit, but that's not enough. And because there's lots of motivations in our life. You might want to go to the gym, you might want to eat a cake. And those things conflict, and so motivation is actually a really, really hard lever to pull on. What he points out is that, well, the prompt is really simple. If you can prompt someone to do something without even thinking about ease or motivation, then you solve the problem already. So start with the prompt. Obviously, that's not going to be enough in all circumstances, so then think about making the behaviour easy, and then finally think about motivation. And realistically, you probably have to think about all these things. But if you do it in this order, you might be surprised at how effective it can be. So let's go back and remind ourselves of what was happening to Kate. So she did her awareness training, then she went on holiday. She clearly forgot about it all. She's coming down the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It's just all gone from her mind. She's got a lot on at work. And then on the fateful day, she gets asked to do something. And we're really not sure what she's going to do. Can she remember what she was meant to do? Let's go through that again and think about how we could have helped her. Now we're thinking about this idea of timeliness. So perhaps when she got back from her holiday, some sort of reminder about her security awareness. Now, this isn't that different to the idea of just drip feeding things quarterly, but we're just keeping security a little bit more front of mind, and that's obviously going to have an impact. And what's interesting here with the Ebbinghaus curve is that she's now jumped back up to the top, and as she falls back down, she won't get to quite such a low base, and she won't fall quite as quickly. But she will start to forget things like we all do. So what about maybe a little bit later on, she gets some sort of reminder. And if you can make this topical as well, then that really plays to some of those biases I talked about earlier, that idea of availability. Because in her mind, it becomes linked to maybe a news story, something else she's heard about, something that's familiar, like another company that's been hacked. And so that's why stories and news and making things topical and relevant to people's home lives can be really effective. But she's still coming back down this curve, and then on the fateful day, she's more distracted than ever, she's a bit hungover. What if we could deliver something at this very point in time that she was doing this behaviour? When she tried to upload a file, if we could intervene at that point, we've got the timeliness and we've got the message that we need to get across to her. So let me unpick that a little bit more, thinking about the psychology and what we've just talked about. Every decision we make takes place in a context. And for us in the world of cyber, mostly that context is on your device. Obviously, physical security is slightly different, but mostly we're on our device and we're worried about that context. There's some sort of trigger and then we act. Phishing is an obvious example here. In comes the email to your inbox as the context and you click on the link. Where are we going to help? Well, what we believe is that we want to get into this sweet spot right in the middle here, potentially just before the trigger, because then you're priming someone to think about this. So imagine if you open your inbox this morning and you just get a reminder, it takes you 2 seconds to look at it, just reminds you phishing is a thing. You wouldn't do it every day, but that's just enough to prime people. And some research we did with Cardiff University proved that this could have a significant impact in people then going on to spot phishing in their inbox. Or what about if you could get in here? So that just before the behaviour actually happens, you're acting as that trigger to say, are you sure you want to do that? Or even better, instead of doing that, do this, because pushing people towards a behaviour is much more effective. The problem in the industry at the moment, we think, in security awareness, is that everything we're doing is over here. It's too soon. It almost doesn't matter how good the awareness training videos are. You might get great feedback, yeah, I really enjoyed that video. When you get back to your desk, you're back in the context, are you going to remember it? And then we are seeing some things over here as well, where reacting to SEAM events, and again, as I spoke about earlier, there's a risk here that you're punishing people with training. And frankly, it's too late. The behaviour's already happened. So if you really want to reduce risk, yes, you want to give people the skills not to do it again, but if you can stop it happening in the first place, that's even better. So just to pull together some of those key points, and then I'll show some examples of how this can actually work in practice. We need to think about context, because that's where behaviour takes place. So the closest we can get to the context, the better. We need to think about making things easy and actionable. We need to expect that people aren't particularly motivated to act in a secure way. And again, that's not their fault. It's that they've got other motivations that are driving them. Social proof is really, really helpful. So when you're thinking about the content you develop, if you can use that social proof of so-and-so reported this, or the accounts team have reported this, or the CEO got this and reported it, then you're creating that social proof to highlight this is a thing, it's really happening to our organization, but other people are getting involved in solving it. And timeliness is really, really important. And perhaps what we're doing at the moment in the industry is not timely enough. So let's have a look at how you can apply those models and actually deliver some security awareness and train people to deliver behaviour change. So phishing, really good example. What do we want to do? We want people to think before they click, essentially. So let's start looking at the model. And we're looking at BJ Fogg here. And as he said, start with the prompt. So if you can prompt people to stop them doing something, then you can change behaviour without even thinking about anything else. So here, timeliness is really important. You want people sort of in that mindset, I'm in my email, think about phishing. So a clearly visible reporting button is really good here, but it will start to habituate. It will just be that part of the screen you don't see anymore. It's the same with the kind of the header banners in emails when they come into, say, external. It's great for maybe 3 months, but then you just stop seeing it. Ability, make it really easy. Going back to that point about knowledge and expertise, we don't necessarily need to bamboozle people with all the different ways to spot phishing. I mean, obviously some people will get into that, but not everybody. So really simple messages like, if you're not sure, report it. If there's anything you're not sure about, report it. So make it a simple message. And then think about motivation. Help people with their threat appraisal to understand how risky things are. So show them real examples. So rather than fish test training where you're tricking people and probably only training the people who fail, that's a small percentage, why not show everybody an example of phishing from time to time so that they understand what to look for? And what could that look like? Well, here's an example of trying to make that as real-time as possible. So I've got this very, very suspect-looking email that's come into my inbox, but I'm about to click the link anyway, and as I do so, perhaps a little nudge that says, "You sure you know this sender?" It's very subtle, but it's just knocking me off my autopilot, my system 2, into my system 1, kind of thinking, yeah, actually, no, I'm going to think about this. Or maybe a reporting button, but in a slightly different format. So a little bit of movement, sitting on top, so you can change what it says so people don't habituate, and you simply drag and drop to report on it. Or we want to kind of keep people thinking about phishing from time to time. So very subtle little gentle nudge, maybe once a month, maybe less than that even, when people go into their email. So even in its own right, this is reminding people about phishing, so it doesn't necessarily have to do much more than that. But the ideal is that people then engage with it, they click on it, and they get shown an example of a real phishing email. And this is a great opportunity to bring in social proof. Show people emails that other people reported, and that creates that view of, look, this is really happening to this organization. And what about chaining some of these events together? So I'm clicking on a link in an email from someone that I've never had an email from before, and now I get to this web page and I start to enter my password. Well, what if we could intervene at that point and say, look, you just clicked a link in an email from someone you don't know, and now you're trying to type in your password. Are you really, really, really sure you want to do that? And it's all about knocking people off autopilot, but also being as timely as you possibly can. So what about just generally engagement? How do we engage people in security to get better engagement with the awareness? Well, back to Fogg's model again. Timeliness is really, really important. So annual awareness is not going to solve your problem. You want security to just be part of people's everyday life in a way that they're used to thinking about it. So drip feeding, making it ongoing, but also as topical as it can be, because that really helps with it sticking in people's minds. Ability matters, so make it as easy to access as possible, the awareness itself. So at the moment, you normally have to click on something, you have to go off, you have to log on to a site. It's just not part of people's day-to-day. So what about bringing it straight to them so it's there on their device? And then in the messages you're giving people, thinking as hard as possible to make it easy and actionable. And then motivation. Again, you obviously have to deal with motivation. So in the content that you're doing, help people with their threat appraisal to understand the impact of this and the relevance to their lives. Real examples, personal context we find is really effective to drive engagement. So what could that look like? Well, one of the approaches we take to that is an idea of stories that maybe take only 30 to 60 seconds and they're dumped straight onto the person's desktop. And they're actually passive. They're sort of in the background, just hanging around. And what we find is that by leaving them there for a couple of weeks until the next one comes along, we get 80 to 90% engagement with the content. And that's a far cry from sending out an email, say, go and do your mandatory awareness training. Don't get me started on whether you should call it mandatory or not. But so if you send out that email, you'll get about 10 to 15%. So more generally, think about timeliness and how we can help people. And there's loads of examples of here where we can try and help people at the point of risk. So simple things like you're trying to upload a file to a website, or you've just put far too many names into an email to or CC box. Really simple things that lead to really common data breaches that are so easy to nudge people away from. Or again, people signing up to SaaS tools so we can pick up that you've entered your email address into a browser. This is a really hard one for organizations. You can track and you can block certain sites, you can track the emails coming in, but here we can spot that someone's trying to use their work credentials somewhere else. Or there's some sort of DLP aspects of this as well, adding attachments, addressing emails to different organizations. And simple things like nudging on different websites. So this one's quite subtle in that it fades away after 30 seconds. So it's just a tail that's added to the mouse for 30 seconds. It's just enough to get people to think, and then they get on with using the tool that they're perfectly fine to use. So in essence, what we're talking about is trying to move away from this old school. It's not always this bad, obviously, but I think we've all seen security awareness that is like this. It's once a year, it's boring, it's complicated, it can be quite patronising, and it's not in the user's context. And so by the time they get back to the desk, it's forgotten about. And there's research that says it's really not working. It's not changing behaviours. And in fact, the NCSC have recently started a challenge for startups to think about how do you engage people. They're calling it the Better Engagement Challenge because they don't think traditional awareness is working. Talked about fish, test, train. Again, the NCSC are questioning that a little bit. If you want to build a cybersecurity culture and get people on your side, then tricking them and testing them is really not the place to start. So we think there's different ways of doing that. So that's very much what we're about at Think Cyber with our red flags approach. It's about this real time, getting as close to the point of risk as you possibly can, but also drip feeding throughout the year so that awareness just comes to people. It's really easy to engage with. And as I said, making that relevant and keeping that up to date is really important. From the research we've done, there is nothing worse than getting your awareness training the second year and you're like, I did this last year. And the message you're sending to your staff is that we don't care about this enough to have updated it. And that doesn't set them off on the right track, essentially. And then when you get this tiny opportunity to talk to people, that's when you want to be using the behavioural science to make sure that it's as impactful as it possibly can be. So some final observations, just to cover some of those things we talked about. Behaviour takes place in context, so that's where we have to try and help people with our awareness. Change is going to require thinking about prompt, motivation, and ability. And I've said that in the wrong order because it should be prompt, ability, and motivation, and that really matters. Don't start with motivation. Annual, quarterly awareness, it's not enough. It's not timely enough. And we also need rapid change and content cycles nowadays, especially to react to things going on in the world. So if you can work in this manner where you're more timely, then the content can be relevant to what's going on in the news, what's going on. And that comes back to that availability heuristic, where it means that people will remember it. So to really engage people, to change behaviours and sustain it, you need a really different approach. That's what we're all about at Think Cyber with red flags. I'm hanging around outside if anyone wants to come and ask any more questions, because I suspect I've gone over time. Oh, I've got 2 minutes. Have we got time for questions in here? Yeah. Anybody got any questions? Or have I spoken so quickly that...
You mentioned not to get you started on the word-to-mind data.
Yes.
Could you just give us some insight of that
Yeah.
word-to-mind data?
Yeah, the question was about not getting me started on the word mandatory. So we did some research where we interviewed a whole load of people about what they thought about security awareness in its current form and how they thought it should be. And one of the things that came out quite clearly was this idea that if you call it mandatory, then your staff know it's to cover your back, it's not for them. And that's a bit harsh, but that's the reality, and that's the message you're sending. So it can be mandatory, but you don't necessarily have to kind of shape it and frame it in that way. In fact, I was having a conversation with someone earlier, and he was trying to rack his brains about a different wording that had been used in an organisation, which meant exactly the same thing, but just landed a little bit better. So yeah, by all means, try and make sure everybody does it. But if you can take that approach where they choose to do it, and that's where this content, where if you leave it hanging around on the desktop, if you can get 80 to 90% engagement with that without having to force people, then that's brilliant. Now, you can force the last 10%, but you've got to know that you forced them, and those 10% have just gone click, 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 yeah, whatever. And so that matters, that you understand that, and that can be really useful information.
Got 1 minute if you want another question.
Any more questions?
Do you support multiple languages?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's running on the device, so it can pick up the system locale and see what language the menus are meant to be in, and therefore sort of pick that language. Obviously, we need to have therefore put that language on there. But yeah, we do translations in order to make sure it's the right language. And we've had some. So we've done some nudging in simplified Chinese, which is great fun to test because you can't work out how to turn your laptop back. Yeah, and that was really interesting because not only were we nudging in different language, but we were focused on the cultural differences. So rather than protect your colleagues in this company, we were protect your colleagues in China. And that made a fundamentally different to people actually reporting things. So we doubled the reporting rate in just a month. It's not just language, you actually need to think a little bit about getting the language right culturally as well. Thank you very much. Cheers.